Hello and welcome back to Middlesex Partnership Compliance Matters. I'm here today joined by someone with over 40 years experience in banking, nearly half of that in NatWest, and who has held head of compliance and MLR roles for a number of leading foreign banks, Dilip Degamia.
Thanks, Rob. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this vlog, which I really appreciate.
So we're going to be covering a number of areas today. What are the key regulatory issues you think we should focus on?
For me, Rob, regulations are constantly changing, new ones being introduced and old ones being refined to strengthen the controls that were originally defined to be in place. I've picked four areas where I think which are receiving focus. One is the old chestnut, financial crime controls. This has been around for many, many years and still remains the key focus for the regulators. The other one is consumer duty, which has been of key focus over the last year plus and coming to fruition in play with effect from the end of July. And the other one is culture and governance. And I'd like to add board effectiveness to that particular subject as well. And the fourth one is SMCR, or better known as the Senior Management Certification Regime.
Okay, well, that sounds like quite a lot to work our way through. So can you give me a brief highlight of the trends around financial crime controls?
Sure. As I mentioned, financial crime controls and the framework that sits around fin crime controls has been in existence for quite a long time. And over the period, as long as I can remember, the rules and governance around this particular topic is strengthened, the controls have strengthened, the demands from the regulators around what they expect firms to be doing and the standards they should be deploying has increased, tremendously. And I've seen how banks have failed in maintaining controls and delivering the right set of controls applicable to the institution. Now, if you look at, given the number of investigations and fines over the last year, and these are across both big and small banks, the FCA is determined to highlight and name and shame institutions for non-compliance. I mean, no longer are, institutions sort of small enough to escape the radar. Firms have been fined generally under core principles of Principle 3 and also Principle 11. Principle 3, of course, is one where the firm has to, take reasonable care and organize and control its affairs responsibly and effectively with adequate risk management and systems. And this should not be new to any organization. They have to have the right level of controls. We've seen in the last year, I'll give an example of about five institutions where they've received fines, and these are small and large, which just highlights the magnitude of the problem. We got a bank one of the smaller banks called Al Rayyan, was fined just over 4 million. You've got Guarantee Trust, which is a Nigerian entity, was also fined 7.6 million. Gatehouse, slightly smaller in the UK, about 1.5. Santander, 107 million, and Metro around 10 million. Now, you can see the differentials in the proportionality of the fines that have been levied for the good and small banks. But if you look at it in terms of the smaller banks, the three smaller banks that I've mentioned, you're looking at 11 plus million in fines. And to these institutions, that is quite a sizable fine. It eats away into their profits, the capital. And of course, when you're going through all these fines and the run up to the fines and the work that's involved to prevent the higher fines, I guess, and the correction work that needs to be done is very high. And so there are costs on top of that. So they actually eat away considerably into the institution's financials. So it's not to be sort of taken lightly. And as I said, this is ongoing. We're seeing more and more of the smaller banks being caught up in this area. The other principle that I mentioned was Principle 11, and Principle 11 is one which is the catch-all, effectively, and it requires institutions to report matters or concerns of a material nature. Now, you can define materiality in different ways, but if the firm believes that the subject matter warrants a report to the regulators and it's deemed to be material enough, then it should report. Failing to do so sends the wrong signal to the regulators, because it leads them to believe that there's no transparency and also question the integrity of the institution. So it's very important, even if you think you're on the borderline of deciding on materiality, it is best to report for safe grounds.
Okay, and so what are some of the themes that you've seen coming out of the regulatory investigations?
As you well know, that I've actually gone through undertaken a number of S166 prevention work for various firms in my career, and it's some of the themes are quite similar that I've seen. One is for firms are failing to conduct adequate EDD, including the identification of PEPs and information on source of wealth. This, of course, is applicable to the higher risk clients, and especially those institutions who are deemed to be higher risk, having a higher risk clientele on their books. Everyone will have a higher risk clientele, but the most important factor is that you need to identify and undertake extended due diligence to ensure you have correctly identified your client, the client's activity, and of course any exposure to PEP, because this will lead to either concerns, or concerns can be discounted once such EDD has been flagged. The other point that comes across quite key is the lack of quality of ongoing monitoring, or as firms call them, periodic reviews, where once you've taken on your client and you've moved into the development stage of building a relationship with your client, there are times when you should be undertaking ongoing review. And these ongoing reviews are very much set around the client risk level. So, a higher risk client may be subject to a 12-month review. A mid-weighted medium risk client will be around a 24 months period, and the lower risk clients will be around a 36 months period. Now, these risk levels these can change within institution to institution, depending on their exposure and the business in which they're operating and the markets in which they're operating. The periodic assessment, as I just referred to, is not just defined to those end dates, 12 months, 24 months, 36 months. It can be brought earlier because you have a lot of adverse media associated with clients, and those adverse media should be discounted as and when you've seen them. So it could be, it could prompt a review of a client much, much earlier. So the quality of ensuring that once you're tracking, you're assessing what's actually going on with those clients, and adequately reviewing the particular client at those moments to ensure that there's nothing sitting in the evaluation which could come back to bite us and in the end affect the relationship with your client. So not demonstrating that process means that once you've onboarded your client, you're just letting things run and you're not keeping up, with what actually is there in respect to the client, and of course protection from the bank, because you should be demonstrating an ongoing control process. The third one is also becoming quite a key subject, is inadequate risk assessment framework. firms, and I'm very surprised that this still kind of comes up, firms are not able to demonstrate an adequate risk assessment framework. So when I talked about the high, medium, and low risk assessments, it's a framework that sits underneath that or above that before you get to the appropriate classification, which helps you to score the risk levels of your client. And by way of simple example, this will include things like the geographical exposure of the client, the geographical exposure in terms of where they're operating, the product delivery channel, whether they're a PEP, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just high-level themes that actually make up that particular scoring methodology. And of course, to build those methodology, there's a lot of work that goes behind that in terms of where your information is going to come from in order to give you the right level score weightings. So when you have your client, you can easily equate to the relevant risk position.
So how widespread do you feel that these issues are affecting the industry?
The spread, if you can actually put it in the ways as I mentioned earlier, that this is amongst a cross section of banks, smaller banks and larger banks. In terms of the larger banks, the investigations take a lot longer because of the size of the operations. But in the smaller ones, I'm seeing quite a lot of investigations in the smaller institutions, which are sort of the lower medium tier organizations. And why we're seeing the trend a bit more in those areas, in those institutions, is because I think for too long they believe that they could get away with the lesser controls, and thinking the lesser controls will be sufficient. And that really means that they haven't kept up with right trends, haven't kept up with the strength of controls that are needed all the way, in the control process. And I've seen more and more of the smaller institutions get caught by this. As I said earlier, Al Rayyan, Guarantee, and Gatehouse are the smaller of the bunch that I talked about, and the fines associated, according to the size of the institutions, are quite high, and the costs that are associated with the investigations are also very, very large. So I think the smaller end of the market is actually now feeling the brunt at the end of the day. And what we've actually seen also as a result of that, and the heavy duty regulations that are, coming our way and they're in place at this moment in time, some of the smaller institutions have pulled away. There are a number of banks that are closed in the UK because the compliance regulations are just too heavy. And I think in the last 12, 18 months, I've seen quite a few institutions just depart from the UK market. So it is quite widespread, but as I said, it's actually quite visible now, and more so in the smaller sector.
Do you see that as being much of an ongoing issue in terms of smaller banks closing, or do you think that that's just a case of a number of banks who basically were never really that committed, deciding it's all a bit too much?
Yeah, I think it is more around it. I think banks are deciding it's probably too much. The cost of compliance is increasing also, and when you weigh all these points up together, and the amount of money they may be making in the UK is also another factor, because there's a lot of controls that they have to get over. Have decided that they can probably do business elsewhere, where the markets are amenable and the regulations is not as harsh. Institutions were switching to the likes of Dubai and the UAE, but again, now they've been faced with strength of regulations coming in play in those parts as well. So really, there's no escape. But the other propositions for institutions is they concentrate on the home market, and often some of the parent operating arms of the institution in the UK have a very large market in their own countries, and they've decided to concentrate in those markets and keep it lean. So they're not overly exposed, but their exposure to the UK is probably done through a connection with a corresponding route for transmission of monies and what have you, and not so much for them being having to be domiciled in the UK. So I think there is a shift away from that particular method of thinking that we need to be in the UK. Historically, what people have done to be in the UK, of course, is a very prestigious market to be in, and also once you have your set up in the UK, the flow of the money to the UK. Generally, once the money starts to flow to the UK and cleanly moving through, the attention levels are a lot less on a UK bank as opposed to having monies coming from a third world, and then being placed into directly into a UK form of transmission. So there are different factors that play here. But I think, as I said, I think the impact will be that some of the smaller players will fall away over a period of time.
Dilip, thank you. That was fascinating. We're running a little bit short on time, so I'm afraid we're going to have to leave the rest until the next session. But for everybody out there, this is Middlesex Partnership Compliance Matters. I'm Robert Johnson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.